August 12, 1944. First Field Airfield, England. Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., eldest son of Ambassador Joseph Kennedy and brother to the future President of the United States, climbed into the cockpit of a B-24 Liberator bomber that had been stripped of everything that made it an aircraft designed for men. No guns, no bomb bay doors, no unnecessary equipment, just a skeleton crew compartment and 21,170 pounds of Torpex explosive packed into every available space. This was not a bombing mission in any conventional sense. This was a suicide run disguised as innovation. This was Operation Aphrodite, and it represented one of the most desperate, dangerous, and ultimately futile technological experiments of World War II. Kennedy settled into the pilot's seat. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford John Willey, went through the pre-flight checklist beside him. Behind them, packed into the fuselage, the bomb bay, even the wing sections, enough explosive power sat waiting to level an entire city block. This bomber was not going to drop bombs. This bomber was the bomb. The plan was simple in concept, terrifyingly complex in execution. Kennedy and Willey would take off normally, fly the aircraft to 2,000 feet, arm the explosives, activate the radio control system, and then parachute out over the English Channel. A mothership, a B-17 Flying Fortress, flying alongside, would then take control of the unmanned bomber using radio signals and guide it to its target, a massive V-2 rocket facility in Nazi-occupied France. The flying bomb would crash into the target at full speed, and the explosion would obliterate one of Hitler's most dangerous weapons programs. It was brilliant. It was innovative. It was technageous. And it was about to go catastrophically wrong. At 5:52 p.m., Kennedy's B-24 lifted off from First Field. The heavily loaded bomber climbed slowly into the summer sky. Radio operators in the mothership established contact. Everything proceeded according to plan. Kennedy guided the aircraft over the English countryside, heading toward the Channel. At approximately 6:20 p.m., as the bomber reached the Suffolk coast near Blytheburg, something went wrong. The aircraft exploded. Not a small explosion, not an engine fire or a fuel tank igniting. The entire 21,170 pounds of Torpex detonated simultaneously at 2,000 feet altitude. The blast was so powerful that it was felt 10 miles away. Windows shattered across the countryside. A crater 100 feet wide appeared where debris hit the ground. Witnesses described a fireball that seemed to consume the sky itself. Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr. and Lieutenant Wilford Willey were vaporized instantly. No bodies were ever recovered. No remains were ever found. The two men simply ceased to exist, converted in a fraction of a second into human beings, into component atoms scattered across the Suffolk countryside. The explosion was so violent that the investigating board spent weeks trying to determine what had gone wrong. The radio control system was suspected. Perhaps a stray radio signal had triggered the detonation prematurely. Perhaps a mechanical failure in the arming system. Perhaps human error. The investigation concluded with the unsatisfying verdict that the exact cause could not be determined with certainty. But the mission continued. Kennedy and Willey were not the first casualties of Operation Aphrodite, and they would not be the last, because this program, conceived in desperation and executed with courage bordering on madness, represented American attempts to fight Nazi superweapons with improvised superweapons of their own. And like so many desperate measures in war, it would cost far more than it achieved. The story of Operation Aphrodite begins not with American innovation, but with German terror. In June 1944, just days after the successful Allied landings at Normandy, Germany launched its first V-1 flying bombs against London. These were Hitler's Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons, designed to terrorize the British population and disrupt the Allied war effort. The V-1 was a pulse jet-powered cruise missile, essentially a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives. It flew at approximately 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. It was crude, loud, and inaccurate, but it was effective as a terror weapon. Londoners learned to listen for the distinctive buzzing sound of the pulse-jet engine. As long as they heard the buzz, they were safe. When the engine cut out, the V-1 would nose over and plunge to Earth. From engine cutoff to impact was approximately 12 seconds. 12 seconds to find shelter, to dive for cover, to pray. Between June 1944 and March 1945, Germany launched approximately 9,500 V-1s against England. About 4,000 were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, barrage balloons, and RAF fighters. But approximately 2,400 reached their targets. The attacks killed over 6,000 people and injured 18,000 more. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. The psychological impact was enormous. Then came the V-2. If the V-1 was terrifying, the V-2 was nightmarish. This was the world's first long-range ballistic missile, a technological marvel that was decades ahead of its time. The V-2 stood 46 feet tall, weighed 27,000 pounds fully fueled, and carried a 2,200-pound warhead. It was powered by liquid oxygen and ethanol, reaching speeds of 3,500 miles per hour and altitudes of 55 miles. The rocket reached the edge of space before plunging down on its target. There was no defense against the V-2. No warning, no time to take shelter. The missile traveled faster than sound. The first indication of attack was the explosion itself, followed seconds later by the sound of the rocket descending through the atmosphere. By the time you heard it coming, the attack was already over. Germany launched approximately 3,000 V-2 rockets during the war. About 1,400 hit London and southern England. Another 1,600 targeted Antwerp and other cities in liberated Europe. The V-2 killed approximately 9,000 people total, including 2,700 in England. Each attack was random, unstoppable, and utterly terrifying. Allied intelligence knew where many of these weapons were being manufactured and launched. Massive concrete bunkers had been built across occupied France to protect V-1 launch sites and V-2 production facilities. These structures, called heavy sites by intelligence officers, were among the most heavily fortified positions in Europe. Some had concrete walls and roofs 16 feet thick, reinforced with steel. Conventional bombing had proven largely ineffective. Heavy bombers could drop thousands of pounds of bombs on these targets with minimal damage. The Allied High Command was desperate. The V-weapons were not going to win the war for Germany, but they were killing thousands of civilians and tying up military resources that were needed elsewhere. Fighter squadrons that could have been supporting ground forces in France were instead flying defensive patrols over England. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned around London rather than supporting the advance across Europe. Something had to be done. In the summer of 1944, Major General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, approved a radical proposal. If conventional bombing could not destroy these hardened targets, perhaps unconventional methods would work. The concept was simple. Take war-weary bombers, aircraft that had flown dozens of missions and were nearing the end of their service lives, strip them down to reduce weight, pack them with explosives, far more than they could ever carry in their bomb bays on a normal mission. Have a small crew take off and fly the aircraft to altitude, then parachute out over the English Channel. A mothership, a B-17 Flying Fortress flying alongside, would then take control of the unmanned bomber using radio signals and guide it to its target, a massive V-2 rocket facility in Nazi-occupied France. The flying bomb would crash into the target at full speed, and the explosion would obliterate one of Hitler's most dangerous weapons programs. It was brilliant. It was innovative. It was technageous. And it was about to go catastrophically wrong. The radio control system was the Castor unit, a primitive but functional remote control system that could operate the aircraft's flight controls via radio signals from a mothership. The system used vacuum tubes, mechanical servos, and a television camera mounted in the nose to allow the controller in the mothership to see what the drone aircraft was seeing. By 1944 standards, it was cutting-edge technology. By modern standards, it was laughably crude. The arming system was the most dangerous component. The explosives had to remain safe during takeoff and the initial flight. Only after the crew bailed out would the bombs be armed. This required a complex system of switches, safety interlocks, and time delays. The system had to be reliable enough that it would not arm prematurely and kill the crew. It also had to be reliable enough that it would definitely arm after the crew bailed out, or the entire mission would be wasted. These two requirements, perfect safety and perfect reliability, were fundamentally in tension. The engineers did their best. Their best would prove insufficient. The crews who volunteered for Operation Aphrodite were an unusual group. These were men who had completed their required combat tours, who had survived 25 or 30 missions over Germany, who had earned the right to go home. They volunteered for one more mission, the most dangerous mission imaginable, for reasons that varied from man to man. Some sought glory. Some sought adventure. Some believed in the mission. Some simply could not imagine going home while the war continued. Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. was perhaps the most notable volunteer. At 29 years old, he was the eldest son of one of America's most prominent families. His father had been ambassador to Great Britain before the war. His younger brother Jack, who had already earned fame for his actions commanding PT-109 in the Pacific, was being groomed for a political career. Joe Jr. was the golden boy of the Kennedy family, athletic, charismatic, and driven to excel. Kennedy had completed his required missions as a Navy patrol bomber pilot. He had flown anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic for months. He could have gone home. Instead, he volunteered for the most dangerous mission the Navy could offer. Some historians suggest he was competing with his younger brother's heroism. Others argue he simply believed in the mission. Whatever his motivation, on August 12, 1944, he climbed into that B-24 Liberator packed with 10 tons of explosives and took off on a flight from which he would never return. The first Operation Aphrodite missions had been flown by the Army Air Forces starting in early August 1944. The results were mixed at best. On August 4th, the first drone successfully took off and was guided toward its target, a V-2 facility at Watten, France. The pilot and co-pilot bailed out successfully. The mothership took control and guided the aircraft toward the target, but the television guidance system failed. The controller could not see where the drone was going. It crashed miles from the target in an empty field. The explosion was impressive, but militarily meaningless. More missions followed. On August 6th, another drone targeted the Watten facility. This one came closer, crashing near the target and causing some damage to surrounding areas. But the bunker itself was undamaged. Its 16-foot-thick concrete walls and roof had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of attack. The flying bomb had made a crater, destroyed some outbuildings, but failed to penetrate the main structure. The engineers adjusted the tactics. Perhaps the drones needed to dive more steeply to achieve better penetration. Perhaps they needed to target weaker points in the structures. Perhaps they needed more explosives. Each mission was a test, an experiment conducted under combat conditions with volunteer crews risking their lives. Then came the Navy's turn. Operation Anvil used Navy PB-4Y1 Liberators, the Navy designation for B-24s. The mission planners selected their most experienced pilots. Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. and his co-pilot Lieutenant Wilford Willey were chosen for the first Navy mission. Their target was the massive V-2 facility at Mimio-X, France. This site housed multiple V-3 superguns, enormous artillery pieces with 430-foot-long barrels designed to bombard London from France. Intelligence estimated the facility was so heavily fortified that nothing short of a massive explosion delivered directly to the structure could destroy it. Kennedy and Willey went through intensive training on the drone aircraft and its systems. They practiced the bailout procedure repeatedly. The plan was for Kennedy to fly from the left seat while Willey monitored the arming panel. At the designated point, Willie would arm the explosives and activate the radio control system. Then both men would move to the nose wheel compartment, open the hatch, and drop through. Parachutes would deploy automatically. The entire bailout procedure should take less than 2 minutes. On the morning of August 12th, the weather was good. The mission was approved. Kennedy and Willie boarded their aircraft, now officially designated Bunno 32271, but known to the crew as the drone or the robot. Other Navy personnel loaded the final components and performed last-minute checks. The mothership, a PV-1 Ventura, would be piloted by Lieutenant John Anderson with a radio control operator, Electronics Officer Earl Olson. 2 camera ships would film the mission for analysis. At 5:52 p.m., Kennedy released the bricks, and the overloaded bomber began its takeoff roll. The aircraft was grossly overweight, carrying more than twice its normal loaded weight. But the first field runway was long, and Kennedy was an experienced pilot. The bomber lifted off and climbed slowly away from the field. Everything proceeded normally for the first 28 minutes of flight. Kennedy reported his position and status. The mothership maintained formation. The camera ships captured footage of the drone climbing toward its assigned altitude. The mission was going exactly according to plan. Then, the explosion. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing a bright flash, followed by a massive fireball. The sound came seconds later, a deep concussive boom that rattled windows and knocked people off their feet. Debris rained down across a wide area. The largest piece of the aircraft recovered was a section of wing panel about 3 feet square. Everything else was fragments, none larger than a hand. The investigation began immediately. Navy explosive ordnance disposal teams combed the crash site, collecting fragments, analyzing debris, trying to reconstruct what had happened. The 2 most likely theories were a premature detonation of the explosive cargo or a catastrophic fire that had cooked off the torpex. But the evidence was literally scattered across miles of countryside. The most damning finding was that the explosion had occurred before Kennedy and Willie were supposed to arm the explosives. They had not reached the bailout point. They were still flying the aircraft manually when it exploded. Something in the system had failed catastrophically. Either the arming system had a fault that caused premature detonation, or some external factor, perhaps a stray radio signal from a nearby radar installation, had triggered the electronics. The Navy suspended Operation Anvil pending the investigation. The Army Air Forces continued Operation Aphrodite missions, but with increased safety protocols and additional safeguards in the arming systems. The program continued because the need was still urgent. The V weapons were still falling on London, the hardened targets were still operational, and the Allies still had no other way to destroy them. Between August and December 1944, Operation Aphrodite missions continued intermittently. Additional Army Air Forces crews flew drones toward targets in France and Germany. The success rate was abysmal. Of approximately 14 missions flown, only 1 could be considered even marginally successful. Most drones crashed miles from their targets. Some lost radio control and crashed randomly. Several exploded prematurely, though fortunately without killing their crews who had already bailed out. The tactical problems were numerous and cumulative. The radio control system was unreliable. Radio interference from German defensive radar and from Allied communication systems would sometimes disrupt the control signals. The television guidance system was primitive. The cameras had low resolution and limited range. Controllers in the mothership often could not clearly see what they were aiming at until it was too late to correct. The television technology of 1944 was in its infancy for practical applications. The camera system used in the drones was based on the RCA iconoscope, one of the first practical television cameras. It provided a fuzzy black and white image with approximately 240 scan lines of resolution. For comparison, standard definition television in the modern era uses 480 to 576 scan lines. High definition uses 720 or 1080. The operators in the mothership were trying to identify and hit specific buildings and structures, using a television image that was barely better than looking through a fogged window. The control system also suffered from lag. Commands sent from the mothership to the drone took time to transmit, process, and execute. A controller might see that the aircraft was drifting left and input a correction, but by the time that correction took effect, the aircraft had drifted further. Overcorrection was common. The drones would weave across the sky, making stable flight toward a target nearly impossible. Weather was another constant problem. The missions required clear skies over both England and the target area in France or Germany. Such conditions were rare in Northern Europe. Missions were scrubbed repeatedly due to clouds, rain, or fog. When missions did launch, they sometimes found that by the time the drone reached the target area, weather had moved in and obscured visibility. German defenses adapted quickly. Once German commanders realized what was happening, they stationed fighters near known drone approach routes. The drones were slow, undefended, and predictable. They were easy targets for experienced Luftwaffe pilots. Several drones were shot down by German fighters before they could reach their targets. The motherships, flying close to observe and control the drones, were also vulnerable. German fighters attacked them as well, forcing them to break off control and defend themselves. Anti-aircraft fire was another hazard. The drones flew straight and level once under remote control, making them ideal targets for German flak batteries. The thick, concrete bunkers that were the targets of these missions were also surrounded by concentrated anti-aircraft defenses. Approaching close enough to accurately guide a drone meant flying through intense flak, endangering both the drone and the mothership. The fundamental problem was that the technology was not mature enough for combat operations. Radio control of aircraft was possible, but not reliable enough for precision attacks. Television guidance was possible, but not clear enough for accurate targeting. The concept was sound. The execution was premature. Despite these failures, the program continued because there were still targets that conventional bombing could not destroy. On November 5, 1944, an Operation Aphrodite mission targeted the submarine pens at Helgoland in Germany. These were massive, concrete structures protecting U-boats, with walls up to 23 feet thick. Conventional bombs simply bounced off. The drone made it to the target area and was guided toward the pens, but at the last moment, radio control failed. The drone veered off course and crashed into the sea, exploding harmlessly. One of the few successful missions, or at least the closest thing to success the program achieved, came on September 3, 1944. A B-17 drone loaded with 20,000 pounds of Torpex was guided toward the U-boat pens at Helgoland. The crew bailed out successfully. The mothership maintained control. The television guidance worked well enough to identify the target. The drone crashed into the structure at high speed and exploded. The blast was enormous. Witnesses reported that the fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. The shock wave was felt miles away. When reconnaissance aircraft photographed the site the next day, they found significant damage. The explosion had blown a crater in the structure and destroyed several support buildings. But the submarine pens themselves, those massively thick concrete walls and roof, were still intact. The structure was damaged but functional. The U-boats could still operate from the facility. This was the best result Operation Aphrodite achieved: significant damage to a heavily fortified target, but not destruction, and it had cost one B-17, 20,000 pounds of explosives, and months of preparation. The military calculus was unfavorable. Conventional bombing raids, while less spectacular, were actually more effective when cost and resources were considered. The program's casualties were not limited to Kennedy and Willey. On August 4, 1944, during one of the first missions, Technical Sergeant Elmer Most was killed when his parachute failed to open after he bailed out of a drone aircraft. On August 6th, First Lieutenant John Fisher was killed when the engine of his drone aircraft caught fire during takeoff. The aircraft crashed and exploded before he could bail out. Several other crew members were injured during bailouts or when motherships were attacked by German fighters. By December 1944, both Operation Aphrodite and Operation Anvil were quietly terminated. The official reason was that the tactical situation had changed. Allied ground forces had overrun most of the V-weapon launch sites in France. The V-1 attacks on London had largely ceased. The V-2 launches continued from sites in the Netherlands, but these were mobile launchers, not fixed facilities that could be targeted by drone aircraft. The unofficial reason was that the program was a failure. The technology was not ready, the tactics were unsound, the casualties were unacceptable, and the results did not justify the costs. In an era when the Army Air Forces was launching 1,000 bomber raids that destroyed entire cities, sending individual drone aircraft against hardened targets made little tactical sense. But the legacy of Operation Aphrodite extended far beyond its immediate military impact. The program represented the first serious American attempt to develop unmanned combat aerial vehicles. The technology developed for the radio control systems, the television guidance, the remote piloting, all of this would inform inform post-war developments in drone aircraft and guided missiles. The engineers and technicians who worked on Operation Aphrodite went on to careers in the aerospace industry. They took the lessons learned, the hard-won knowledge of what worked and what did not, and applied it to the next generation of weapons systems. The cruise missiles that would be developed in the 1950s and 1960s owed their existence in part to the experiments conducted under Operation Aphrodite. The modern drone, the Predator and Reaper unmanned aerial vehicles that have become central to American military operations in the 21st century, are direct descendants of the technology pioneered in 1944. The basic concept, an unmanned aircraft controlled remotely and guided to a target, is identical. The execution is incomparably more sophisticated, with satellite communications, high-definition cameras, GPS navigation, and precision-guided munitions. But the fundamental idea was proven in the skies over England and France in 1944, even if the execution was deadly flawed. The human cost of Operation Aphrodite was small by World War II standards. Perhaps a dozen men killed, a similar number injured. Compared to the thousands who died in the bomber offensive over Germany, this was statistically insignificant. But each of those deaths represented the same tragedy, the same waste, the same grief for families back home. Joseph Kennedy Jr.'s death had particular resonance because of his family's prominence. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., was devastated. He had opposed American entry into the war. He had advocated for accommodation with Nazi Germany. Now, his eldest son, the one he had groomed to be president someday, was dead, killed in a mission that achieved nothing. The tragedy would haunt the Kennedy family for generations. John F. Kennedy, Joe Jr.'s younger brother, was profoundly affected by his brother's death. Some historians argue that Jack's subsequent political career was driven in part by a desire to fulfill the ambitions his father had held for Joe Jr. The burden of family expectations, already heavy, became crushing after August 12, 1944. Jack would carry that burden all the way to the White House and through his presidency until his own assassination in 1963. The military lessons of Operation Aphrodite were documented in detailed after-action reports. The Army Air Forces and Navy both conducted extensive reviews of the program. The conclusions were consistent. The concept had merit, the technology was premature, future development should focus on reliability and accuracy before attempting combat operations. The guidance systems needed orders of magnitude improvement. The control systems needed redundancy and fail-safes. And most critically, manned aircraft should not be used as delivery systems for these weapons. The risk to crews was unacceptable when balanced against the limited probability of success. These lessons were applied to post-war weapons development. The cruise missiles of the 1950s and 1960s used jet engines instead of piston engines. They used inertial guidance systems instead of radio control. They were launched from ground platforms or ships instead of having pilots fly them part of the way. The technology matured slowly over decades, but it eventually matured into weapon systems that could do what Operation Aphrodite attempted: deliver massive explosive payloads against hardened targets with precision. The targets that Operation Aphrodite had attempted to destroy were ultimately eliminated by other means. Allied ground forces overran the V weapon sites. The submarine pens were captured by advancing armies. The concrete bunkers that seemed impenetrable in 1944 were bypassed by strategic developments that made them irrelevant. The war moved on, and the heavily fortified structures became abandoned relics. In the decades after the war, some of these structures became tourist attractions. The submarine pens at various German ports were partially demolished or converted to other uses. The V-2 bunkers in France were either destroyed by French authorities or left to decay. The physical evidence of Operation Aphrodite's targets gradually disappeared, but the memory of the mission lived on in military aviation circles. The story of the flying bombs became part of Air Force and Navy lore. The tale of volunteers who flew aircraft packed with explosives, knowing they had to bail out over enemy territory or die, became an example of extraordinary courage. The fact that the missions achieved so little made them seem almost quixotic, brave men tilting at concrete windmills. Joseph Kennedy Jr. was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration for valor. The citation praised his courage and devotion to duty. His name was added to the long list of Kennedy family members who had served and sacrificed. His younger siblings, including John, Robert, and Edward, would all go on to political careers shaped in part by Joe Jr.'s death. The other casualties of Operation Aphrodite received their own honors. Most were posthumously promoted. All were remembered in their units and by their families. But unlike Kennedy, their stories faded from public memory. They became statistics, names in casualty lists, footnotes in histories of World War II. The technological legacy proved more enduring than the military one. By the 1960s, the United States had developed cruise missiles that could do everything Operation Aphrodite attempted and more. The AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile could fly hundreds of miles, navigate using terrain-following radar, and strike targets with precision. The Tomahawk cruise missile could be launched from ships or submarines, fly over 1,000 miles, and hit targets within a few meters of aim point. These weapons owed their existence to the lessons learned in Operation Aphrodite. The engineers who designed them studied the failures of 1944 and designed systems to overcome those failures. Better guidance systems replaced primitive television cameras. Jet engines replaced unreliable piston engines. Solid-state electronics replaced vacuum tubes. Redundant safety systems prevented premature detonation. The technology matured over decades, but its roots reached back to those desperate experiments over England and France in 1944. The modern military drone, the unmanned aerial vehicle that has become central to American military operations in the 21st century, are the ultimate descendant of Operation Aphrodite. The MQ-1 Predator and MQ-9 Reaper drones that patrol the skies over conflict zones worldwide use satellite communications instead of line-of-sight radio control. They carry precision-guided missiles instead of being the missile themselves. But the fundamental concept, an unmanned aircraft controlled remotely and used to strike targets, is identical to what was attempted in 1944. The difference is that modern technology has made the concept practical. High-definition cameras provide clear imagery. GPS navigation provides precise positioning. Satellite communications provide reliable control over unlimited distances. Computer processing allows for sophisticated autopilot systems that can fly the aircraft while the operator focuses on the mission. All the pieces that were missing or inadequate in 1944 have been developed and perfected. If the engineers and pilots of Operation Aphrodite could see a modern Predator drone in action, they would recognize it immediately. They would understand what it was doing and why, and they would feel vindicated. The concept they had risked their lives to prove was sound. The execution in 1944 was premature, but the idea was correct. Unmanned aircraft could be used as precision weapons against hardened targets. It just took another 50 years of technological development to make it work reliably. The story of Operation Aphrodite is ultimately a story about the gap between concept and capability. The idea was brilliant, the need was urgent, the volunteers were brave, but the technology of 1944 was not adequate to execute the concept reliably. The result was a program that achieved little militarily, while costing lives and resources that could have been used elsewhere. It was also a story about desperation. The Allied High Command was so concerned about V-weapons and hardened targets that they were willing to try radical, unproven solutions. They were willing to risk volunteer crews on missions that had low probability of success. They were willing to commit significant resources to a program that existed more in hope than in realistic assessment of capabilities. This desperation was understandable. The V-weapons were killing civilians daily. The submarine pens were protecting U-boats that were sinking merchant ships. The hardened bunkers seemed impervious to conventional attack. Something had to be done, even if that something was risky and experimental. The fact that Operation Aphrodite failed does not mean the attempt was wrong. It means the technology was not ready. The program also demonstrated American willingness to experiment and innovate under combat conditions. While other nations might have conducted laboratory tests and development programs before attempting combat operations, the Americans tried to compress development and deployment into a few months. This approach sometimes succeeded spectacularly, as with the proximity fuse and other wartime innovations. Sometimes it failed, as with Operation Aphrodite. But the willingness to try was itself significant. For the families of the men who died in Operation Aphrodite, the military and technological justifications meant little. Their sons and brothers and husbands were gone. The missions that killed them had achieved nothing of lasting value. The program was canceled and largely forgotten. The sacrifice seemed meaningless. But in the longer view of history, their sacrifice was not meaningless. It was part of the painful, expensive process of technological development. Every successful weapons system has a development history filled with failures, false starts, and accidents. Operation Aphrodite was one chapter in that history. The men who tested the concept were pioneers, even if the missions they flew were failures. The most poignant aspect of Operation Aphrodite is how close it came to success. If the radio control had been more reliable, if the television guidance had been clearer, if the arming systems had been safer, the program might have achieved its objectives. The margin between failure and success was narrow, a matter of technology that would be developed within a few years. But in war, timing matters. Technology that arrives too late is as useless as technology that never arrives at all. Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. and the other volunteers who flew Operation Aphrodite missions were heroes, regardless of the program's failure. They took on missions that they knew were extraordinarily dangerous. They accepted risks that were higher than normal combat operations, which were already deadly. They did so because they believed the missions were important, because they wanted to contribute to victory, because they were brave men willing to sacrifice for their country. The fact that the missions failed, that the program was canceled, that the technological gamble did not pay off, does not diminish their courage. It makes their sacrifice more tragic, but no less honorable. They were warriors testing the boundaries of what was possible, pushing technology and tactics to their limits, accepting death as a likely outcome. Operation Aphrodite stands as a reminder that war is a forcing house for technological innovation, but that innovation comes at a cost. The desperate need for new weapons and tactics drives experimentation. But not all experiments succeed. Some fail catastrophically. Some kill the very men they were supposed to protect. The price of innovation in wartime is measured in lives, and that price is paid before anyone knows whether the innovation will work. On a quiet hillside in Suffolk, England, there is a small memorial to Lieutenant Joseph Kennedy Jr. and Lieutenant Wilfred Willey. It marks the approximate location where their aircraft exploded on August 12, 1944. Visitors who find the memorial are often surprised to learn about Operation Aphrodite. The program has been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the larger events of World War II. But for those who study military history, for those who understand the development of unmanned aerial systems, for those who recognize how modern drone warfare evolved, Operation Aphrodite is significant. It was the first serious American attempt to develop what we now call precision-guided munitions delivered by unmanned aircraft. It failed in 1944, but it succeeded eventually. The drones that patrol the skies today, striking targets with precision that would have seemed miraculous in 1944, are the vindication of the concept that cost Kennedy and Willey their lives. The flying bombs of Operation Aphrodite never destroyed their targets, but they pointed the way towards weapon systems that would dominate warfare in the 21st century. The sacrifice of the men who flew these missions was not in vain. It was an investment in a future they would never see, paid in the only currency that matters in war: